Hi everyone, there had been a horrible word going around this year. The N-word.
Everyone was stronger, to a point where the next one's going to be, you know what, the N-word.
And what is this N-word?
You know what the N-word is, right?
Nuclear.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
I figured you'd want to clean that up. No, it's the N-word. That's a very nasty word, right? In a lot of ways. The N-word used in a nuclear sense, that's the worst thing that can happen.
That's right, nuclear annihilation, which is what some people were worried about with the Israel-Iran conflict that ended months ago. The word is so atrocious that I hear that teenage boys are currently using that word in Call of Duty lobbies. Maybe they will start dropping N-bombs to finish their matches like in Nuketown. Sorry, N-word town. I don't have much to comment on the past Israel-Iran conflict, and considering the trend of my channel, I'll finally make a video about it after a nuclear holocaust from my grave 6 feet under the ground, probably arising from the Russia vs Ukraine war, or Khomeini finally developing nuclear weapons. Actually, today's video was meant to come out during the Israel-Iran conflict 3 months ago, but there was another word, the G word, gentrification. But what is gentrification? It's a concept where when people or families from wealthier backgrounds move into poorer neighborhoods where their incomes and status make their properties more valuable. As more wealthy people move in, not only do their properties increase in value, but the nearby properties that house poorer families will have their home values increase. This will as a result increase the value of rental properties, so poorer families will have to pay higher rents, maybe more than they can afford to, so are priced out.
Keep your money-grubbing hands away from my hard-earned yachts.
And people with higher incomes will lead to local businesses in the neighborhoods cater to these wealthy people by making higher priced goods, or businesses will move into the neighborhood that only the rich can afford. Think of, for instance, a Starbucks. So when poorer families face higher rents and higher prices from businesses, the costs are too high and they are forced to move. At least that's how the narrative goes. This is also known as the demand effect in one of the papers I will show later in the video. There are also concerns that gentrification also negatively affects minorities, where since minorities are generally poorer, they will get priced out.
Now that's just racist.
Oh, those poor minorities, like African Americans being scared of hearing N-bombs. You know, nuclear bombs, because of, you know, the Israel-Iran conflict that just ended. But who's the culprit? Corporate greed, apparently.
And today, you know, in the 2020s, the powerful forces that are propelling gentrification include large multinational corporations that see housing stock as an investment, as an asset class, and that are literally banking on the value of urban real estate increasing, oftentimes in a quick time frame, and so they are kind of actively pushing forward the kinds of changes to the urban environment that they believe will propel that price increase.
Developers or multinational corporations see housing as an asset class. They want to buy housing and see the values of such housing go up so that they can sell it at a much higher price and make faster profits. Probably faster than the brave and beautiful streamer Frogan.
I have no pity at all for any soldiers.
But probably not as fat as that Trigglypuff meme. Jokes aside, do property developers buying up housing to make a quick buck lead to gentrification? Does a market system producing more housing for rich people cause rents to rise and the poor to be displaced from their homes? Well, according to one study in New York City, there's this market rate housing of high-rise buildings of 7 stories. They are some of the costliest buildings with rents 60% above the average census tracts, so could basically be classified as luxury buildings. So they would be a great case for analyzing gentrification. And remember those businesses who only cater to the wealthy? Well, these luxury buildings also bring similar amenities, as they lead to 9% more restaurant openings. According to the study, quote, rents fell by 1.6% within 500 feet of new high-rises 1 year after their completion, and persistently thereafter. Rents declined for upper, mid, and low-rent buildings within 500 feet, but the results were not statistically significant for low-rent buildings. So rents didn't overall increase despite wealthier buildings being constructed there. Now that's interesting. Well, What about poor people being forced to leave their houses? Well, maybe we should check out San Francisco. Emma Vigeland, what are your thoughts on San Francisco?
You touch on this, and I think it's just so key to understanding. We had an interview recently about San Francisco in particular on this front. But how developers are trying to change the role of urban spaces to a degree, not just, changing the complexion, raising rental prices for, for landlords doing so, or big, real estate interests, but also about creating urban spaces that are not just only livable for wealthier people, but that are playgrounds for people coming from outside the city.
Well, there's this study on San Francisco by Kate Pennington, which looked at market rate housing being produced in San Francisco, where there seems to be another example of gentrification. As within 100 meters of these new market rate developments, there was a 16% rise in residential renovations and a 20% increase in business turnovers. But within the same 100 meter radius, the risk of displacement to a neighborhood with a lower income falls by 17.1%. Not rises by 17.1%, falls. And it even lowers rents by 2% within the same radius. So what gives? Why do property developers building gentrifying buildings actually lower rents and make more houses? Because when you build more houses, consumers and families have more houses to choose from. They have more bargaining power. So producers of housing are forced to charge a lower price. And with a higher availability, families are less likely to be displaced from housing. This next part will make things much clearer. In another paper, Evan Mass analyzed 700 market rate multifamily developments in central cities, and then tracked 52,000 of their current residents to their previous address. He then identifies the current residents of those buildings and traces them back to where they used to live. This study finds an interesting effect. When people move, they probably have higher than average incomes of their previous metro area, which means a housing vacancy for a family will leave another vacancy that is a lower price for another family in a similar area. In other words, when a highly priced housing vacancy opens up, a wealthy family with the means and intent to buy that property will move in and leave their old home, which may be priced at the level of an upper middle class family. And an upper middle class family finds this housing vacancy and buys it. Then they leave their own property, which allows a less wealthier family to buy that property, and this family leaves another cheaper property, which allows a less wealthier family to buy that property, and this family leaves another cheaper property, which allows a less wealthier family to buy that property, and this family leaves another cheaper property, which allows a less wealthier family to buy that property, and this family leaves another cheaper property, which allows a less wealthier family to buy that property.
2 hours later.
And this family leaves another cheaper property, which allows a lower income family to buy that property due to its cheaper price. Basically, more market rate housing frees up space in cheaper housing, since it provides more housing vacancies / options for lower income families. This is because homes become more affordable as they age because of new housing. And this is evident by the following. Mast estimates that building 100 new market rate units lead to 45 to 70 and 17 to 39 people moving out of below medium and bottom quintile income tracts, respectively, creating slack in the lower end housing market. Almost all of this effect takes place within 5 years. Unquote.
I understand nothing.
Now, the more intelligent of you might argue, but people living nearby these newly vacant properties will much less likely have the opportunity to live at that property, since people from other areas will try to move in as well. So, a mover could face competition to live at a single local property from the entire United States. But we don't need to worry about this, since most people move within regions, as 67% of residents moving in 11 cities are from the same metro area. And here's another thing. Quote, Mast's research illustrates the active mechanism behind filtering, the process by which homes become more affordable as they age. That mechanism is new building. Without new homes coming onto the market, migration chains cannot be initiated, and filtering cannot readily occur. This helps explains the findings of Liu, McManus, and Yiannopoulos, in which older homes filter up, aka gentrify, to higher income households in markets with limited housing production. Unquote. Well, I think that sells it. Gentrification, at least when it comes to housing, doesn't hurt poorer people. It helps them, because it provides more housing vacancies for poorer people.
Yes, it's so true that there is an active process behind it. There are actual decision makers. There are actors who both facilitate the spread of gentrification and who actively pursue it and encourage it. I think in many cases we can look to local government and even higher levels of government for smoothing the spread of gentrification, if you will, clearing the path by removing any sorts of regulations that would slow it down. That might include things like rent stabilization or anti-eviction measures or control over the kinds of development and what developers need to kind of give back to the city in order to build their projects. So the city is, I think, an active agent in that way.
It's interesting she mentions rent stabilization, because that's basically rent control, which is when landlords are limited in the amount of rent that they can charge. And a great city to look at the efficacy of rent controls is San Francisco. In 1979, rent control was enacted in San Francisco by capping annual rent increases to 7% for all rental units built before 1979, but owner-occupied buildings with 4 units or less were exempted. These exempted properties made up 44% of rental stock in 1990. But the larger corporations took advantage of this exemption by buying up these small units and sell a small share to a live-in owner to satisfy the exemption. The city obviously got annoyed by this, so removed this exemption in 1994. So we have the properties built before 1979 that were subject to rent control, and the multifamily rental properties of 4 units or less, which weren't subject to rent control until 1994. So we have a pretty good natural experiment.
Perfection.
While renters under rent control were 10 to 20% more likely to stay at the 1994 address compared to those not under rent control has bad incentives. As new construction was exempt from rent control, landlords demolished their old buildings and built new properties, meaning the number of renters living in rent-controlled units fell by 25%. And if the properties weren't demolished, then sometimes landlords would redevelop rent-controlled properties into condos. Rent-controlled buildings were 8% more likely to convert to a condo or tenancy in common than non-rent-controlled buildings. Landlords of rent-controlled buildings also disproportionately took out additional permits, but conversions to condos would require such permits. Now, this is a really intriguing part of all of this. These converted condos and condominiums cater to higher income individuals, and combined with rented properties being converted to owner-occupied properties, and the number of renters living in each building going down, means that rent control actually fueled a form of gentrification.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
This is evident by how some rent-controlled tenants actually left these rent-controlled areas, but it was a very select number of areas, and these selected areas had become wealthier as evident by lower unemployment rates, higher college shares, and higher house prices. This would be consistent with the idea that landlords would undertake efforts to remove these tenants or convince them to leave in improving gentrifying areas. Because of rent control, housing supply was reduced by 6%, which led to a citywide rent increase of 5.1%. It's hard to enforce these rent control laws and catch landlords violating them, since the rent board that is responsible for ensuring that landlords don't charge a higher rent price only audit 10% of units each year. I wonder if lefties want to change their mind on defunding the police if it comes to rent control. Regardless, if progressives want rent control, then they should be the first in line to advocate for market rate housing. Why? Well, remember that study on market rate housing in San Francisco by Pennington? Well, it was found that within 100 meters of a market rate development site, eviction notices fell by 31% in rent stabilized housing, but did not change for non-rent stabilized housing. This is because landlords have incentives. They want higher rents, and if market rents rise by a lot, but the rents that certain landlords charge can't go up because they have rent control properties, then they have incentives to evict their tenant and get new tenants and reset the rent price to market rates. But when you build more houses, When you don't restrict the building of houses, you increase the supply of homes, which lowers overall prices. So when you increase market rate housing, in the case of this San Francisco study, overall rents fall and landlords in rent-controlled properties have less of an incentive to evict, since market rents are lower.
I understand nothing.
So this video isn't commenting on the full debate when it comes to gentrification. But when it comes to the intersection of housing and gentrification, it's clear that more housing and those evil rich property builders building more wealthier housing does not displace poor people or raise rents. It does the opposite. By the way, if you guys are enjoying the video so far, feel free to comment "build more housing" or anything else to boost my video in the algorithm, as well as consider subscribing. Anyway, back to the video. Now, if rich people buying up houses and gentrification isn't what's causing high house prices, then what is? After all, if you ask most people, they aren't optimistic about the current housing market for them or their kids. One theory is the neoclassical view, which claims that houses are expensive because land is expensive. There is a lot of demand for certain areas, and there is a limited supply of land by its very nature, so we should see high prices as a result. But there may be another reason. Maybe house prices seem so high, not because of a lack of land or rich people hoarding it, but because of government regulation, through something like zoning laws and other building restrictions. Similar to how rent control caused reductions in supply in San Francisco, but on a larger scale. As I hinted at before, when you place restrictions on building more homes, you increase the cost of building homes, decreasing the incentive to build more homes. This cut in supply leads to higher house prices when demand is constant. These restrictions can manifest as building permits, where it takes way too long to approve construction of a home, and as an implication, there may actually be enough land to develop homes. There are two different ways of valuing land. One is subtracting the cost of construction from the home price, then dividing by amount of land. We call this method the extensive margin method. The other method was using, quote, a housing hedonic, and compare the price of comparable homes situated on lots of different sizes. With these comparisons, we are in principle able to back out the value that consumers place on larger lots. A housing hedonic is a pricing methodology which takes into account internal and external factors that affect the price of a home. These internal factors can be the characteristics of a house, like the number of rooms, appearance, and electric appliances, while external or environmental factors can be crime rates, pollution levels, and accessibility to local schools. Controlling for internal factors can help give you a better idea of external factors. Under the neoclassical view that limited land causes high house prices, there should be no difference between the price given by the extensive margin method and the price given by the housing hedonic method. But if there are large differences between the prices, then this can indicate that the regulation interpretation is true instead. Using data from the 1999 American Housing Survey, the researchers used factors like number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, garages, whether a home is in a central city, basements, and the age of the home. This was done for 26 metropolitan areas to compute the housing hedonic prices. So was there a difference? A matter of fact, it was, as the hedonic housing price was 10% of the extensive margin housing price. This indicates that only 10% of house prices was due to land. So the higher house prices can't be attributed to scarcity of land. Then again, some people might say that this is just evidence that rich people are hoarding this land and raising it to artificially high prices, and hence a great argument for rent control or nationalizing houses.
We could also think about those, the playground for capital, if you will, where wealthy investors or speculators who may never set foot in the city own urban real estate, own residential spaces that sit empty. And this, I think, to many activists and to local residents is a real slap in the face when people are struggling to find housing and knowing that apartments are sitting empty and just accruing value for people who will literally never visit or live in them is just so shameful, I think, for us to witness.
But is this true? Well, we can test it out by checking for regulations like zoning permits. using the 1989 Wharton Land Use Control Survey to find measures of zoning in the central cities of 45 metropolitan areas. The researchers find a time between the application for a zoning permit and the issuance of said building permit. The value of zoning takes a value of 1 if the amount of time it takes to receive a permit is less than 3 months, a value of 2 if it takes between 3 and 6 months, a value of 3 if it takes between 7 and 12 months, a value of 4 if it takes between 1 and 2 years, and finally a value of 5 if it takes more than 2 years. As you increase the index by 1, 15% of the housing stock becomes quite expensive. In addition, quote, increasing a single category in terms of permit issuance lag is associated with a nearly $7 per square feet increase in the implicit zoning tax. So the high housing prices is correlated with burdensome regulations and excess zoning permit waiting times.
I understand nothing.
Granted, it's possible instead that maybe the high priced areas somehow led to higher zoning restrictions than the other way around. So I will be investigating this link further in the future. But given the other studies I have put forth in this video, if you want to solve the housing crisis and gentrification, restricting the building of houses is a bad idea. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment as it really helps me in the YouTube algorithm, and please consider subscribing. I'm thinking about my next video either being about Charlie Kirk or maybe even Zoran Mandani or something else. I'm really not sure, but I'm just glad to be on YouTube again after such a long hiatus. Also, feel free to check out the Political Checkmate who recommended the Gentrification Study. But you know what, see you guys later. Thanks for watching and bye for now.